It's been part of Ireland life since 1890. The Jersey Evening Post, originally just the Evening Post, has survived where others have fallen by the wayside, and now, in the 21st century, its massive collection of photographs has been given to Jersey Heritage for safekeeping. No one knows quite how many there are, 1 million images perhaps, and the job of numbering and cataloguing them is being undertaken by staff and volunteers, including Peter Mouron, for many years the newspaper's chief photographer, now retired.
A lot of them are traceable, as in, we've got the photographer's diaries, so we know what we're looking at. When we've got a particular job number, we know that that's the Battle of Flowers or something, whatever. But equally, there are boxes and boxes of individual cut 35mm negatives that is going to be an absolute guessing game as to what they are. They're all going to be archived, they're all going to be scanned in, and that's a mammoth task. And it's going to rely on my memory and the public's memory of what some of these things are. There's also a huge store of beautiful 5x4 glass plates from the 1920s sort of onwards up until the 60s, I suppose, where the quality is fantastic. And again, a lot of this stuff won't have ever been seen before. The photographer would take 36 pictures, come back to the Evening Post, he'd look at them all, he'd maybe print 4 or 5, maybe 1 or 2 would get in the paper, and the rest would have gone into the file and never be seen until what we're doing now.
Where to start? The subject is vast. So Peter Mouron has chosen a selection of his favourite images from the 1930s and 40s, which tell the story of 2 very different Jerseys, before and after the German occupation. Sailing off Goree, these black and white photographs portray a carefree life when war seemed far away. A fete at Samaray Manor, the home of Conservative MP and shipping magnate Sir James Knott, who bought it in 1924 and became the Seigneur of Samaray. PT instructor Reg Nicole running Keep Fit classes for locals and visitors at the Lower Park on Victoria Avenue. And sand racing at St. Juan before the German Sea Wall.
Photographers were experimenting with what was a new format, 35mm, which then became the format that I used and lots of other people used. But it was very experimental at that stage, and you can see that there would be a roll of film and they'd take stuff and then they would experiment. You could see them experimenting different techniques, different light, and that's really nice to see that unfold.
Some examples?
Yeah, and also what's interesting, of course, is that so many of the things that they were photographing we're still doing today. Sand racing. The crowds were enormous, and I love this particular picture because you can still see all the huts that lined the sand dunes. There was no proper sea wall then at this end, and all those huts were demolished after the war and never rebuilt. We have one here of a family just enjoying themselves down at Waynay, and the thing about the 30s, and particularly 38, 39, innocent pleasures of people having carnivals down at Halfday Par bathing pool, which seems to be a real sort of focal point for people in those days. And it is quite odd to think that within months the island was occupied, and every photograph I look at, I wonder, did these people make it through? And it's particularly interesting with, there are a number of photographs of soldiers who had gone off to join up and then came back on leave months before the island were occupied. So they were probably back on leave, and then before they knew it, back again and fighting. There's this particular poignant one of a family leaving the harbour with their soldier husband with all his kit. And then he would have been gone off and fighting within months, and you just wonder whatever happened to all of them. It's got a lovely feel to it, and it makes you wonder whether that picture ever appeared in the paper, and I suspect not. Because they were looking for faces, I mean, I can remember not long after I joined, I went to photograph a Mr. Hobbs, who was retiring as the lighthouse keeper at Corbière. And we did the interview, and I took a number of photographs of him. And I took one of just his back view, looking back at the lighthouse, which he'd spent all his life working at. And to me, it summed up the story much better than him looking at the camera. And I had a devil of a job to persuade the people at the paper to use it. Luckily they did, but you know, that was an example of you know, you're hoping that photography would outweigh the sort of traditional view of how a photograph should look. 1939 Battle of Flowers. One of the floats led by a poster saying "Peace to all nations," and somebody dressed up as Neville Chamberlain waving his Munich piece of paper. The girl holding the "Peace to all nations" has got a sash saying Germany on it and other countries. And not long after this was taken, "Peace to all nations" was well and truly trashed. There's another image, a float showing somebody dressed up as Mussolini, somebody dressed up as Hitler, and all sort of doing fascist salutes. The Battle of Flowers in those days was not only a very popular Jersey event, but Pathé News and the Daily Express and the Daily Mail would all turn up and record it, and you could see it all in the national papers. It was quite a thing.
Fast forward 6 years, occupation years, during which the Evening Post lacked photographic film, and the images are of a liberated Ireland struggling to return to normal. The first commercial flights, at the end of May 1945, to an airport opened as recently as 1937, but now looking fit only for demolition. And German prisoners of war kept on to clear up the mess.
This caught my eye, which was German prisoners of war who were kept on in the island, and here recovering all the huge steel tank traps that were laid along the beach at St. Catherine's, and also other German prisoners of war collecting concrete fence posts, digging them up from Archirondell.
Finally, among these very personal choices by Peter Mouron, a surprise. A curiously framed photograph of my late father, John Lazell, well known in the post-war years as a footballer for First Tower United, repeatedly selected to play for Jersey in the Inter-Island Muratti.
Rather strange that the sort of he's down in the bottom right-hand corner in all this space, but I think there's a whole list of them, so they were all going to be ended up used as the 11 players. Team players were going to be used in the paper as little headshots, but it's a nice, a smiling, optimistic post-war photograph to end on. It's wrong to say I feel ownership of this stuff. I don't, but I definitely feel like I'm a bit of a guardian of it while I'm around and able to make sense of all this. But it's a great social history of the island, unique, being the only newspaper, so it's worth doing.